Please join me in welcoming Perry Pendley, the author of Sagebrush Rebel.
When it came to energy, natural resources, and the environment, Reagan knew exactly what he wanted to do. Of course, he had been governor of California, and like the other 10 western states, California is a federal land state. The United States government does own a third of the nation, most of that in the American West, and California, like Colorado, half of it was owned by the federal government. And so Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, knew the federal government, not just when it was a sovereign, but also when it was a landowner, and in many of the cases, a bad neighbor. And so he had that experience. He knew the agencies, he knew the Park Service, knew the Fish and Wildlife Service, knew the U.S. Forest Service, knew the Department of Agriculture and Bureau of Reclamation. He had experience with those agencies firsthand, and he brought that knowledge with him in the years ahead. Something phenomenal about Reagan was that he had a photographic memory. And that's not just from Ed Meese and Bill Clark and George Shultz, but Lou Cannon, the famous Reagan biographer, points that out. And it's one of the reasons why Reagan, once he had experience with an issue, brought that experience with him into the future. The second thing that happened was that Ronald Reagan, after he left being governor, made a decision that really was tremendously important, and he decided not to go into television. Of course, he had been for years in television, but he was offered the opportunity to appear on a weekly broadcast up against some liberal talking about some topic or other. And he said, I'm afraid the public will get tired of me on television. It'll never get tired of me on radio. And so he embarked upon these weekly radio addresses, hundreds, thousands of radio addresses that he gave over the years. He took a brief break when he ran for president, first in 1976, and then resumed those radio broadcasts as he continued on until he decided finally to run for president successfully in 1980. And in those addresses, he covered the issues that he thought were important to the American people, issues of foreign affairs, energy, the environment. And interestingly enough, Reagan believed that all those issues were wrapped up together. Our foreign affairs problems were tied up with our economic problems, were tied up with our energy problems, and he saw the solutions to those problems in the federal lands the federal government owned. Most of the land the federal government owns, of course, as I say, is in the West, and it's in an area of the country that's just geologically unique and provides tremendous opportunity for the development of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and also strategic and critical minerals. And so Reagan knew that was a great opportunity. In addition, the federal government owns all the acreage off the Outer Continental Shelf. Outside of state waters, 1 billion acres of land. And Reagan knew that there was great opportunity there to solve our energy problems. Reagan did not believe the government when it came to the government's view of our energy future. In a famous radio address, he went by the years, by the decades, through what the government had predicted would be our energy future and proved that government was wrong. Decade after decade after decade, the federal government got it wrong with regard to our energy future. Check out a couple of books if you haven't read them, In His Own Hand and Reagan, His Path to Victory, where Marty Anderson has put together those wonderful Reagan speeches, many written in his own hand. In my book, I set out an incredible laundry list of issues that he covered, and he writes, not in the style of, but he writes like a man who spent a long time at the Department of the Interior, or maybe at the Department of Agriculture, and I don't mean down in some agency, but a high policy level. So he had staked out those issues very clearly on where he wanted to go and what he thought the future should be. And then as president, he implemented those policies. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he moved forward with doing it, and he continued to monitor what was going on. He followed closely what was going on. Two of his radio addresses, he continued the radio address tradition, and every president since him has followed with that tradition, I don't think as successfully as Ronald Reagan did. But he continued to do the radio addresses, and many of them he wrote himself. The two key addresses that I feature in my book, one in June of 1983, one in October of 1983, he wrote out by himself. One I have a copy of in the book in his own hand. The other we don't have the record of in a handwritten copy, but I do have a copy where the typist has put up in the corner, R.R. wrote. And so by his own hand, he followed these issues, he wrote, he covered these issues, and he also made sure that his policies were going to be implemented by picking 3 secretaries of the Interior in which he had a great confidence. Jim Watt out of Wyoming, he met him and concluded that this was a man who was true to his word, was going to follow through on what he said and what President Reagan wanted to do. Bill Clark, when Jim left, Judge Clark went in. Judge Clark called by one of his biographers Reagan's top hand. He was the go-to person for Ronald Reagan. People say that Judge Clark was closer than any other person to Ronald Reagan outside of course, Nancy Reagan herself. And then after Bill Clark went back to California, Don Hodel, a tried and true successful secretary over at the Department of Education. And in fact, Ed Meese suggested to the president, gee, maybe we ought to make Don Hodel Attorney General. Instead, he made him Secretary of the Interior. And he picked these 3 men to do the work that he wanted to have done, that he had envisioned back when he was governor, that he continued to talk about when he was a radio address speaker and writer, and he continued to back each and every one of them. One of the things that's been fascinating, I had hoped a book like this would have been written back in the 80s or certainly the 90s, but it wasn't until 2000 that we really saw something that helped us understand what Reagan's philosophy was, how he went about these things, how truly he believed in these issues, until his diaries came out in 2004. And it's fascinating to me when I read his diaries to see how closely he was following all of these issues. The second general area I'd like to cover is about environmental extremists. And the book is subtitled, Reagan's Battle with Environmental Extremists and Why It Matters Today. And the term environmental extremist is, interestingly enough, Reagan's own. This is what he referred to them. At one time he called them modern-day Luddites, which I thought was pretty cool. And Reagan said that in a radio address and then went on to explain what a Luddite was, for those of his audience might not know. And environmental extremists lied about Reagan and continue to lie about Reagan in 3 very important respects. First of all, they lied about Reagan when they said we did not oppose him initially. The great myth that environmentalists like to talk about today, and they talked about shortly after he left office, was that, well, you know, we really didn't dislike him at first. We were on the fence. We were trying to make up our minds. We just didn't know how we were going to come down, and then he started to do those crazy things he did, and we had to come out against him. Environmental groups took a position against Ronald Reagan very early, and they stuck with it. Publicly, what was known to the public generally at the time was that in September of 1980, 21 environmental groups representing millions of members of environmental organizations went to the Carter White House, endorsed President Carter for re-election, and then stepped out on the White House lawn and excoriated Ronald Reagan. They didn't just endorse Carter. They attacked Reagan, and the attack was relentless. What's more interesting to me was even a year earlier, something the press did not notice, and oh, by the way, the New York Times said about that White House appearance in October of 1980, this is a remarkable change. Because for the first time in history, environmental groups have taken a side in a presidential election. And I think it was the first time, and it was set the stage for what environmental groups have done ever since. They are today, in my view, an arm of the Democratic Party. It's not about the environment, it's about politics. But even a year earlier, environmental groups had traveled to Denver, Colorado, to take on what they saw as a real threat to them, which was the Sagebrush Rebellion. While I was writing this book, I Googled for Sagebrush Rebellion and War in the West, Carter War in the West. And frankly, there wasn't much out there. I was very surprised, and so let me bring you up to date. The War on the West, some scholars say, well, the War on the West really started with the passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976. when the way in which we use our federal land, the BLM lands across the West, the U.S. Forest Service lands across the West, changed dramatically. We were no longer going to sell any of the land. We were going to keep it. We were going to preserve it forever. And